If you have ever stood in a casino long enough, watching lights flash and coins spill in carefully engineered celebration, you begin to notice something curious about the machines themselves. They feel permanent, immovable, almost sacred. Yet there was a time when one man treated them as puzzles rather than institutions. His name was Tommy Glenn Carmichael, and for several decades he quietly made a career out of outsmarting the American gambling industry, one device at a time. He was not a gangster in the traditional sense, nor a violent criminal. He was something far more irritating to those tasked with protecting casino revenue, a patient mechanic with a talent for observation and a stubborn refusal to lose. Tommy Glenn Carmichael was born in 1950 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, into a working-class environment that rewarded practicality over ambition. His early life gave little indication that he would one day become one of the most notorious slot machine cheats in American history. He was not particularly academic and did not pursue higher education in any serious capacity. Instead, he gravitated toward mechanical work and the sort of hands-on tinkering that often begins in childhood with radios and broken appliances. Like many men of his generation, he moved through a string of ordinary jobs and modest ambitions, eventually landing in the world of television repair. It was a practical trade and one that required careful attention to circuitry, wiring, and the inner logic of machines. That quiet apprenticeship would later prove invaluable in ways he could not yet imagine. By the early 1980s, Carmichael found himself struggling financially. The television repair business had begun to decline as sets became cheaper and more disposable, and customers were less inclined to fix rather than replace them. It was during this period of professional uncertainty that he was introduced to the world of slot machine cheating. The introduction did not come through a dramatic criminal recruitment or an elaborate conspiracy, but rather through a casual acquaintance who mentioned a device known as a top-bottom joint. The name sounded almost harmless, but its purpose was precise and illegal. It was a small metal tool designed to manipulate the internal mechanisms of certain mechanical slot machines, allowing the user to trigger payouts at will. Carmichael's first reaction was not fear but fascination. The idea that a machine designed to take money could be persuaded to give it back appealed deeply to his mechanical sensibilities. He acquired one of these early cheating devices and began studying it carefully. The tool itself was simple, essentially a bent piece of metal inserted into the payout chute of a slot machine. Once inside, it could be used to trip the switch that released coins. The process required dexterity, timing, and an understanding of how different machines were constructed. It was not a guaranteed success, but in the right hands it could be remarkably effective. He began experimenting in local casinos and gaming establishments, initially with modest results. Early attempts were clumsy and occasionally unsuccessful, but he persisted. Unlike many opportunistic cheats who relied on luck and bravado, Carmichael approached the task with the methodical patience of a technician. He studied the machines, observed casino routines, and refined his technique. Over time, he became proficient enough to extract significant amounts of money without attracting immediate attention. What began as a desperate attempt to supplement his income gradually evolved into a full-time occupation. The sums involved in those early years were not enormous by modern standards, but they were substantial enough to sustain him. A skilled operator using a top-bottom joint could extract hundreds or even thousands of dollars in a single evening, depending on the location and the machine. Carmichael traveled extensively across the United States, visiting casinos in Nevada, Atlantic City, and smaller gambling hubs scattered throughout the country. He learned to move discreetly, avoiding patterns that might draw suspicion. He dressed plainly, behaved politely, and never lingered longer than necessary. As his confidence grew, so did his ambition. He began to modify and improve the tools he used, experimenting with different shapes and materials. His background in electronics and mechanical repair allowed him to understand slot machines at a level most casual cheats never achieved. He did not simply use the tools, he engineered them. This capacity for innovation would become the defining characteristic of his criminal career. The first major turning point came when casino operators began to notice unusual payout patterns. Slot machines that should have been reliable profit generators were suddenly producing unexplained losses. At first, management suspected internal theft or accounting errors. Surveillance technology in the early 1980s was primitive compared to modern standards, consisting largely of grainy cameras and human observation. Identifying a skilled cheat under those conditions was exceedingly difficult. Carmichael exploited that gap with quiet efficiency, moving from location to location and leaving behind only the faintest statistical anomalies. Eventually, however, suspicion hardened into investigation. Casino security teams began sharing information, comparing notes on unexplained payouts and suspected methods. Law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over gambling operations grew increasingly interested in the emerging pattern. Carmichael, meanwhile, continued refining his technique and expanding his operations. He was no longer merely using the tools he had acquired, he was designing his own. One of his earliest innovations was an improved version of the top-bottom joint that allowed for more precise manipulation of the payout switch. He experimented with different metals and dimensions, seeking a balance between durability and subtlety. The resulting devices were small enough to conceal easily, yet robust enough to withstand repeated use. He carried them in his pockets, hidden in plain sight among coins and keys. To an untrained observer, they appeared innocuous, even mundane. In reality, they were the instruments of a highly specialized form of theft. During this period, Carmichael developed a disciplined routine. He would enter a casino, survey the floor, and select machines that offered the best opportunity. He avoided high traffic areas and preferred machines located near exits or in corners where surveillance was less intense. Once seated, he would insert a small amount of money and play briefly to establish a pattern of legitimate behavior. Only then would he deploy his device, working quickly and discreetly. The entire process could take less than a minute. When successful, the machine would release a stream of coins, as though a legitimate jackpot had been won. Carmichael would collect the payout calmly, leave the area, and move on to another location. Despite his growing expertise, he was not immune to mistakes. On several occasions, casino staff grew suspicious and confronted him. In most cases, he managed to deflect attention or leave before a thorough search could be conducted. His demeanor played a crucial role in these encounters. He was polite, cooperative, and outwardly unremarkable. There was nothing about his appearance to suggest the presence of hidden tools or criminal intent. Security personnel often lacked sufficient evidence to detain him, and he slipped away repeatedly. Investigators found this particularly frustrating. Reports from various casinos described a man matching Carmichael's general appearance, but the descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Surveillance footage, when available, was often too grainy to provide clear identification. By the time patterns began to emerge, he had already moved on to other locations. The absence of a centralized database for casino security incidents further complicated efforts to track him. Each establishment operated largely in isolation, sharing information only sporadically. Carmichael exploited these structural weaknesses with quiet precision. The first confirmed arrest came in the early 1980s after a security team in Tulsa observed suspicious behavior and detained him long enough for a search. Hidden on his person were several cheating devices, carefully concealed but unmistakably illegal. He was charged and eventually served time in prison. For most individuals, such an experience might have served as a deterrent. For Carmichael, it became an education. Prison introduced him to other individuals involved in gambling-related crimes, including a man who would profoundly influence his future trajectory. This individual demonstrated a more advanced device known as a slider, designed to manipulate slot machines in a different manner. Unlike the top-bottom joint, which triggered payouts directly, the slider interfered with the machine's internal counting mechanism. By inserting the device into the coin slot and applying pressure at the correct moment, a user could cause the machine to register multiple credits without depositing additional coins. It was a subtle and highly effective method, particularly against older mechanical machines. Carmichael studied the slider with intense interest. He memorized its dimensions, its method of operation, and its limitations. Upon his release from prison, he set about creating his own version, using materials readily available from hardware stores and drawing on his technical background. He produced a refined model that was both durable and discreet. The device could be carried easily and deployed quickly, allowing for repeated use across multiple machines. This innovation marked the beginning of the most profitable phase of his criminal career. Armed with his improved slider, Carmichael returned to casinos across the country. The results were immediate and lucrative. He could now generate credits without triggering obvious mechanical payouts, reducing the risk of detection. Machines would register legitimate play while quietly accumulating false credits that could be cashed out later. The process required patience and precision, but he possessed both in abundance. During this period, he is estimated to have extracted tens of thousands of dollars from casinos across multiple states. Precise figures are difficult to establish, as many incidents went undetected or unreported. What is clear is that his activities caused significant concern within the gambling industry. Machines that had been considered secure were suddenly vulnerable, and losses began to mount. Investigators attempting to track him encountered persistent obstacles. Carmichael traveled frequently, used aliases when convenient, and avoided establishing predictable routines. He paid for accommodations in cash and maintained a low profile. When confronted or questioned, he remained calm and cooperative, rarely providing information that could be used against him. His technical expertise allowed him to adapt quickly when casinos introduced countermeasures. If a particular machine became difficult to manipulate, he simply moved on to another model or location. One investigator later described the experience of pursuing him as trying to catch a ghost who understood machinery better than the people who built it. Surveillance teams would review footage showing suspicious payouts, but find no clear evidence of tampering. Machines would be inspected and found mechanically sound. By the time patterns were identified, Carmichael had already moved on, leaving behind only financial discrepancies and a growing sense of irritation among casino operators. His activities did not go entirely unnoticed, however. Law enforcement agencies began to coordinate more closely with casino security departments, sharing information and developing profiles of suspected cheats. Carmichael's name surfaced repeatedly in these discussions, though concrete evidence remained elusive. He continued to operate with cautious confidence, refining his methods and expanding his reach. By the late 1980s, he had become something of a legend within certain circles. Among fellow cheats and small-time criminals, his reputation for ingenuity and discretion was well established. He was known not for flamboyant displays of wealth or reckless behavior, but for quiet efficiency and technical skill. He did not gamble for entertainment and rarely indulged in conspicuous spending. To him, slot machines were not games, but systems to be understood and exploited. It was during this period that he began to consider the broader implications of his work. The devices he created were not only tools for personal use, but potential commodities. Other individuals involved in slot machine cheating expressed interest in acquiring similar devices, and he recognized an opportunity. By producing and selling refined sliders and related tools, he could generate income without personally visiting every casino. The idea of becoming a supplier rather than solely an operator appealed to his practical instincts. This shift in strategy would eventually bring him into contact with a wider network of individuals involved in gambling-related crimes, some more competent than others. It also increased the risk of exposure. Every device sold represented a potential link back to its creator, and every user represented a potential liability. Carmichael understood these risks but proceeded nonetheless, driven by a combination of financial incentive and technical curiosity. As he expanded his activities, casino losses continued to accumulate. Investigators grew increasingly determined to identify and apprehend the individual responsible for designing and distributing the devices. Surveillance methods improved. Communication between casinos became more efficient, and law enforcement agencies devoted greater resources to the problem. The stage was set for a prolonged and increasingly sophisticated contest between a solitary technician and an entire industry determined to stop him. The next phase of his career would involve more advanced machines, more elaborate devices, and a level of cat-and-mouse tension that would test the patience of everyone involved. It would also produce a catalogue of missing money that remains difficult to quantify even today, scattered across countless machines and locations, each instance a small but persistent reminder that even the most carefully engineered systems can be undone by a patient mind with a piece of bent metal. By the time Tommy Glenn Carmichael stepped fully back into the world of slot machines after his first prison sentence, he no longer saw casinos as intimidating institutions. He saw them as evolving machines that required study. The fluorescent lights, the patterned carpets, the repetitive music and coin noise were simply environmental details. What mattered to him was circuitry, timing, and the predictable habits of people who believed their systems were secure. He returned not with the reckless hunger of a gambler, but with the steady patience of a technician resuming a long-term project. The slider he had refined after prison was, by all accounts, a remarkable piece of criminal engineering. It was slender enough to slip into a coin slot unnoticed, shaped to interact with internal components that most casino technicians rarely saw directly. With subtle pressure applied at precisely the right moment, it could trick certain mechanical slot machines into registering credits without the insertion of actual coins. The machine believed it had been fed, and so it played along. For a patient operator, this meant generating dozens or even hundreds of phantom credits that could later be cashed out in legitimate-looking payouts. Carmichael treated the process with the discipline of a craftsman. He did not rush. He rarely stayed at one machine long enough to draw attention. He rotated between locations, sometimes crossing state lines simply to avoid establishing patterns. He favored smaller casinos and gambling venues where surveillance was less sophisticated and staff turnover was high. In these environments, familiarity worked in his favor. He became a quiet, regular, rather than a suspicious stranger, another middle-aged man passing time in front of a machine. Money accumulated slowly but steadily. Unlike dramatic casino heists that relied on single large scores, Carmichael's method produced a continuous stream of smaller, less noticeable losses. A few $100s from one machine, 1,000 from another, several thousand over the course of a long evening across multiple locations. Over weeks and months, the total grew substantial. Yet because the losses were distributed across time and geography, they were difficult to attribute to a single individual. A rough catalogue assembled years later by investigators attempting to reconstruct his activities suggested that during the mid to late 1980s alone, Carmichael and those using his devices may have extracted well over $100,000 from slot machines across Oklahoma, Nevada, California, and parts of the Midwest. Some estimates place the figure far higher, though precise accounting proved impossible. Many machines were never examined closely enough to reveal tampering, and many casinos preferred to absorb small, unexplained losses rather than publicize vulnerabilities that might invite further exploitation. The quiet nature of these thefts became one of the most frustrating aspects for investigators. Unlike table game cheating, which often involved visible sleight of hand or collusion, slot machine manipulation left little obvious evidence. A machine that paid out credits appeared to be functioning normally. Surveillance footage might show a patron sitting, playing, and eventually collecting winnings. Without clear footage of a device being inserted or a mechanism being manipulated, suspicion remained just that. Carmichael's calm demeanour and unremarkable appearance compounded the difficulty. He did not fit the stereotype of a professional criminal. He looked like someone's neighbour. At some point during this period, Carmichael began selling modified sliders and related tools to other individuals interested in exploiting slot machines. This transition from solo operator to supplier marked a significant escalation. He was no longer responsible only for his own activities, but indirectly for the actions of anyone using his devices. The decision was driven partly by financial logic. Selling devices allowed him to generate income without personally risking exposure at every casino. It also satisfied his technical curiosity. Each new machine design presented a challenge, and creating tools to defeat them became an absorbing pursuit. The network that formed around these devices was loose and inconsistent. Some buyers were competent and cautious, following his instructions carefully and operating discreetly. Others were reckless, using the tools clumsily and drawing immediate attention. These less disciplined users created problems not only for themselves but for Carmichael. Every arrest involving a slider risked leading investigators back to its source. He attempted to manage this risk by limiting direct contact and maintaining plausible deniability. Devices were sold quietly, often through intermediaries or brief meetings that left little trace. Despite these precautions, the spread of sliders began to produce noticeable effects within the gambling industry. Casino operators across multiple states reported unusual patterns of machine behavior and unexplained credit accumulation. Technicians dismantled machines and occasionally discovered faint signs of manipulation. Word spread quickly through security networks. Slot machines, long considered reliable sources of profit, were proving vulnerable to a new and poorly understood method of cheating. Investigators responded with growing irritation. Meetings were held between casino security directors, gaming commission officials, and law enforcement representatives. Descriptions of suspected devices circulated. Surveillance footage was reviewed repeatedly, yet the individual responsible remained elusive. One investigator in Nevada reportedly spent weeks examining dozens of machines that had produced suspicious payouts, only to conclude that someone out there understands these things better than we do. The comment, delivered with equal parts admiration and frustration, captured the prevailing sentiment. Micro-stories of these investigative frustrations accumulated quietly. In one instance, a surveillance team in a Reno casino identified a pattern of unusual credits on several machines over a 3-day period. They reviewed hours of footage, focusing on a handful of patrons who had used those machines. Carmichael appeared in several sequences, always behaving normally. He inserted coins, played briefly, collected modest payouts, and left. Nothing in his movements suggested tampering. By the time suspicion solidified, he had already departed the state. In another case, a small tribal casino in the Southwest experienced a series of unexplained losses on older mechanical machines. A technician dismantled one unit and noticed subtle wear patterns near the coin slot that did not correspond to normal use. The discovery prompted a review of recent patrons. Again, Carmichael's presence surfaced, but only after he had moved on. Investigators circulated his description and possible aliases, yet the information arrived too late to produce an arrest. The absence of centralized data sharing systems at the time further complicated efforts. Each casino maintained its own records and surveillance archives, often incompatible with those of other establishments. Law enforcement agencies faced jurisdictional limitations that hindered coordination. Carmichael moved comfortably within these gaps, aware that by the time information caught up with him, he would likely be elsewhere. Speculation began to emerge regarding whether he was working alone. Some investigators believed the sophistication and distribution of the devices suggested a broader network. Others argued that the consistency of the methods pointed to a single designer supplying multiple operators. A few suspected involvement by insiders within the gaming industry, who might provide technical information or access. These theories circulated in reports and conversations, rarely confirmed but persistent. There is no definitive evidence that Carmichael maintained a large, organized team. He appears to have preferred independence, relying on brief partnerships when convenient and avoiding long-term collaboration that might increase risk. Nevertheless, the possibility of occasional accomplices cannot be dismissed. Individuals purchasing his devices sometimes operated in pairs or small groups, sharing information about vulnerable machines and favorable locations. When arrests occurred, those involved typically provided limited information, either out of loyalty or ignorance of the broader network. In several cases, users claimed to have acquired devices from unnamed sources or through casual contacts, leaving investigators with little to pursue. The catalogue of missing money associated with this period grew steadily. Investigators later estimated that individual slider operators could extract between $2,000 and $5,000 per week from moderately busy casinos without triggering immediate alarms. Multiplied across multiple users and locations, the cumulative losses over several years likely reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some internal casino reports suggested figures approaching $1 million industry-wide, though such numbers remain speculative due to incomplete reporting and the reluctance of casinos to disclose vulnerabilities publicly. As losses mounted, so did pressure on manufacturers to improve machine security. Engineers began redesigning internal mechanisms to resist manipulation. Coin paths were altered, sensors upgraded, and anti-tampering features introduced. Each modification represented a new challenge for Carmichael. He responded as he always had, by studying the changes carefully and developing countermeasures. The process became an ongoing technical duel between designers and a single persistent adversary. One particularly telling incident occurred in a Las Vegas casino where newly upgraded machines had been installed specifically to combat slider use. Within weeks, unexplained credits began appearing once again. Surveillance teams intensified monitoring and eventually detained a suspect using a modified device. During questioning, the individual admitted to purchasing the tool from a man matching Carmichael's description. The admission did not lead directly to an arrest, but it reinforced the growing belief that a single skilled designer stood behind many of the industry's problems. Investigators grew increasingly determined to locate him. Bulletins circulated among casinos and law enforcement agencies. Descriptions were refined, photographs collected, and known associates identified. Yet Carmichael remained difficult to pin down. He continued travelling, adjusting his methods, and maintaining a low profile. His life outside casinos remained modest. He did not flaunt wealth or cultivate notoriety. To neighbours and casual acquaintances, he appeared unremarkable, even dull. This ordinariness became one of his greatest assets. Investigators searching for a flamboyant criminal mastermind instead encountered a soft-spoken technician who blended easily into the background. When questioned during occasional detentions, he displayed polite cooperation and a lack of visible anxiety. Without clear evidence of wrongdoing, authorities often had little basis for prolonged detention. He would be released and quietly disappear once more into the flow of interstate travel. The sense of mystery surrounding him deepened. Within casino security circles, his name acquired an almost mythic quality. Stories circulated of machines inexplicably producing credits, of suspects detained with unusual devices, of losses that could not be fully explained. Each account added to a growing narrative centered on a man who treated slot machines as mechanical riddles to be solved rather than games to be played. As the decade progressed, technological changes began transforming the gambling industry. Mechanical machines gave way to electronic and eventually computerized systems. For many traditional cheats, this shift represented the end of opportunity. For Carmichael, it presented a new and more complex challenge. Electronic machines operated on different principles, relying on microprocessors rather than purely mechanical components. The familiar vulnerabilities exploited by sliders and earlier tools were gradually disappearing. Rather than abandon his activities, he began studying these new machines with the same patient curiosity that had defined his earlier work. He purchased used units when possible, dismantled them, and examined their internal logic. He experimented with new devices designed to interact with electronic sensors and circuitry. The process required more advanced technical knowledge and carried greater risk. Electronic machines often recorded detailed operational data, making anomalies easier to detect. Yet he persisted, driven by the same blend of financial incentive and mechanical fascination that had guided him from the beginning. Investigators, meanwhile, sensed that the contest was entering a new phase. Reports of traditional slider use declined as machines became more secure, but new forms of unexplained behavior began to emerge. Credits appeared where none should exist. Machines entered service modes unexpectedly. Payouts occurred without corresponding wages. The possibility that Carmichael or someone like him had adapted to the electronic era produced renewed anxiety within the industry. The cat and mouse dynamic intensified. Each security upgrade prompted a corresponding attempt at circumvention. Each arrest of a low-level operator raised questions about the source of the devices used. Carmichael remained at the center of these suspicions, a persistent and elusive figure whose technical ingenuity continued to challenge an entire industry. For those tasked with stopping him, the frustration became deeply personal. Surveillance officers spent long hours reviewing footage that revealed nothing conclusive. Technicians dismantled machines only to find them functioning within expected parameters. Law enforcement agents pursued leads that dissolved into ambiguity. The sense of chasing an adversary who understood both machinery and investigative limitations better than anyone else created a quiet, simmering irritation. And yet, beneath the frustration, there was a reluctant respect. Carmichael did not rely on intimidation or violence. He did not carry weapons or threaten staff. His tools were small, precise, and designed to exploit weaknesses rather than confront them. In a strange way, he mirrored the engineers who built the machines he defeated, approaching each new design as a problem to be solved through careful observation and incremental refinement. The next phase of his story would push this technical duel to its most intricate stage. Electronic slot machines would demand more sophisticated methods. Casino security would evolve rapidly in response. The stakes, both financial and personal, would rise accordingly. And somewhere within that escalating contest, the man who had spent years quietly extracting money from flashing machines would begin to consider a future that did not involve cheating them at all. The transition from mechanical slot machines to electronic systems should have ended Tommy Glenn Carmichael's career. For most cheats of his generation, it did. The old vulnerabilities vanished almost overnight. Sliders and top-bottom joints, once so effective, became obsolete as machines adopted microprocessors, digital credit systems, and internal sensors capable of detecting irregularities. Casinos invested heavily in new technology designed specifically to eliminate the sort of manipulation that had sustained Carmichael for years. The machines grew quieter internally, but more watchful. Every coin, every credit, every payout was recorded and stored. For a time, losses attributed to traditional slot cheating declined sharply. Security directors expressed cautious optimism that the problem had been solved through engineering rather than enforcement. Yet Carmichael was not inclined to retire simply because the machines had changed. He viewed the new systems not as impenetrable barriers, but as unfamiliar puzzles. Where others saw defeat, he saw an opportunity to learn. He began acquiring electronic slot machines through secondary markets, purchasing older units from distributors and repair companies willing to sell decommissioned equipment. In quiet workshops and rented spaces, he dismantled them piece by piece. Circuit boards were examined, wiring traced, sensors identified. He studied how credits were registered, how payout commands were issued, and how error conditions were detected. The work required patience and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of electronics. He read manuals when he could obtain them, and relied on experimentation when he could not. This period of study did not produce immediate results. Electronic machines were far less forgiving than their mechanical predecessors. Attempts to manipulate them using adapted versions of earlier devices often triggered alarms or disabled the machine entirely. On more than one occasion, experiments ended with a unit permanently locked in error mode. For someone who had built a career on subtlety, these failures were instructive. They revealed how the machines defended themselves, and where their vulnerabilities might still exist. Gradually, he began to develop new tools. Among the most notable was a device that came to be known within certain circles as a light wand. It resembled an ordinary object, easily concealed and carried without attracting attention. Its purpose was to interact with optical sensors inside specific models of electronic slot machines. By introducing a carefully timed pulse of light into the machine's bill acceptor or sensor pathway, it could disrupt the normal counting sequence and cause the machine to register credits that had not been legitimately inserted. The technique required precise timing and knowledge of specific machine designs, but in skilled hands it proved effective. With this innovation, Carmichael re-entered casinos cautiously. Electronic machines recorded detailed operational data, making anomalies more visible to technicians reviewing logs. He adjusted his methods accordingly, limiting the number of credits generated per machine and avoiding repetitive patterns. The goal was not dramatic jackpots, but modest, consistent gains that blended into normal operational variance. He returned to the quiet rhythm that had defined his earlier years, moving from location to location, never staying long enough to invite focused scrutiny. The catalogue of missing money expanded once again, though as before it remained difficult to quantify precisely. Investigators later estimated that during the early 1990s, losses attributable to electronic slot manipulation using light-based devices and related tools likely exceeded several $100,000 across multiple states. Individual incidents were often small, a few $100 here, 1,000 there, but the cumulative effect across time and geography was substantial. Casinos occasionally identified machines behaving oddly, but without clear evidence of tampering. The losses were often attributed to technical faults or routine variance. Frustration among investigators deepened. The belief that the problem had been solved through technological advancement proved premature. Meetings between casino security directors and gaming commission officials grew more urgent. Reports circulated describing unusual machine behavior consistent with external interference. Engineers were consulted and tasked with identifying possible vulnerabilities. The sense that a single persistent adversary continued to adapt alongside their efforts created an atmosphere of quiet exasperation. One investigator in Nevada later described a particular episode that captured the mood of the time. A series of electronic machines in a mid-sized casino began registering unexplained credits over several weeks. Surveillance teams reviewed footage repeatedly, focusing on patrons who had used those machines. Carmichael appeared briefly in several sequences, always calm, always unremarkable. He played modestly, collected small payouts, and moved on. Nothing in his behavior suggested overt manipulation, yet the pattern of his presence aligned too neatly with the anomalies to ignore. By the time security attempted to detain him for questioning, he had already left the state. Another micro-story emerged from a casino in the Pacific Northwest, where technicians dismantled a machine that had produced irregular credit surges. Internal logs showed credit increments occurring without corresponding bill insertions. Engineers suspected sensor interference but could not determine how it had been achieved. Surveillance footage revealed only a man seated quietly, occasionally adjusting his posture, nothing more. The absence of visible tampering became a recurring theme. Carmichael's methods left few traces and fewer witnesses. Speculation about accomplices resurfaced during this period. Some investigators theorized that access to machine schematics or insider knowledge must be involved. Electronic slot machines were complex, and understanding their vulnerabilities required more than casual observation. Others argued that Carmichael's own technical aptitude was sufficient. He had spent years studying mechanical and electronic systems, and his persistence in acquiring and dismantling machines suggested a self-taught expertise that rivaled that of professional technicians. Occasional arrests of low-level operators using similar devices hinted at distribution networks, but direct links remained elusive. Those detained often claimed to have obtained tools from unnamed sources, or through brief transactions that left little evidence. The possibility that some collaborators escaped detection cannot be entirely dismissed. Individuals who purchased his devices occasionally operated independently, extracting money from machines in locations he never visited. When arrests occurred, the trail frequently ended with the immediate user. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or simple lack of knowledge, few provided information that led further. In several cases, devices recovered during arrests displayed design features consistent with Carmichael's known innovations, reinforcing the belief that he remained the primary source. The sense of chasing a technically gifted phantom persisted. Investigators developed profiles, shared information more efficiently, and expanded surveillance capabilities. Casinos upgraded camera systems, installed more sensitive machine sensors, and implemented software capable of detecting unusual credit patterns. Each improvement narrowed the window of opportunity, but did not eliminate it entirely. Carmichael responded as he always had, adapting methods and shifting locations. The contest became less about dramatic escapes and more about incremental adjustments on both sides. Eventually, however, the balance began to shift. Advances in surveillance technology produced clearer footage and more comprehensive coverage. Digital record keeping allowed for easier comparison of incidents across jurisdictions. Cooperation between casinos and law enforcement agencies improved significantly. Patterns that once went unnoticed for months could now be identified within days. The cumulative effect of these changes increased the risk associated with continued cheating. Carmichael's final arrest in the late 1990s brought an end to his active career as a slot machine cheat. Detained after being linked to the use of a light-based cheating device, he faced charges that reflected years of accumulated suspicion and investigation. The arrest did not involve dramatic confrontation. As in earlier encounters, he remained calm and cooperative. Devices recovered in connection with the case provided tangible evidence of methods that had long been suspected, but rarely proven. For investigators who had spent years tracking unexplained losses and elusive patterns, the moment carried a quiet sense of closure. His subsequent conviction and imprisonment marks the conclusion of a prolonged cat-and-mouse contest between a solitary technician and an entire industry. Yet the story did not end with incarceration. During his time in custody and following his release, Carmichael began to reconsider his relationship with the machines that had defined so much of his life. The technical knowledge he had developed, once used exclusively for exploitation, possessed legitimate value. Casinos and manufacturers, having spent years attempting to counter his innovations, recognized that few individuals understood slot machine vulnerabilities as intimately as he did. In an unexpected turn, he began working with the very industry he had once quietly undermined. Consulting on machine security, he provided insight into the methods used by cheats and the weaknesses that allowed them to succeed. His perspective proved valuable in designing more secure systems and training security personnel to recognize subtle forms of manipulation. The transition from adversary to advisor was not immediate or universally welcomed, but it reflected a pragmatic recognition that expertise could serve different purposes depending on context. The man who had once carried small, carefully crafted tools in his pockets now demonstrated those same devices in controlled environments, explaining how they functioned and how machines could be redesigned to resist them. Engineers and security professionals listened with a mixture of curiosity and residual irritation. For years, he had been the source of unexplained losses and persistent frustration. Now he was, in a sense, helping to prevent future versions of himself. His later life remained relatively quiet. He did not achieve celebrity status or public notoriety on a grand scale. To those who encountered him in professional settings, he appeared measured and reflective, a technician who had spent decades engaged in an unusual form of mechanical competition. The slot machines he once treated as adversaries became subjects of analysis and improvement. The transition did not erase his past, but it reframed it within a narrative of technical evolution rather than simple criminality. Tommy Glenn Carmichael eventually stepped away from active involvement in both cheating and consulting, living out his later years with little public attention. His ultimate fate was not marked by dramatic downfall or lavish success, but by a quiet recognition that the skills he had cultivated could no longer be applied as they once were. The industry had changed, technology had advanced, and the era in which a single patient mechanic could quietly outmaneuver casinos across the country had largely passed. What remains is a story that lingers in the quieter corners of gambling history. A man who treated slot machines not as games but as systems to be understood. An industry forced to adapt repeatedly to one individual's persistence and ingenuity. A long catalogue of missing money scattered across years and locations, much of it never fully accounted for. And finally, an unusual conclusion in which the adversary became, for a time, a reluctant ally, helping to secure the very machines he once studied in order to defeat. In the end, the flashing lights and mechanical chimes continued without interruption. Casinos grew larger, machines more sophisticated, surveillance more comprehensive. Yet somewhere within that constant evolution lies the memory of a technician who approached those machines with quiet curiosity and a bent piece of metal, reminding everyone involved that even the most carefully engineered systems are only as secure as the minds that attempt to understand them.